The book felt heavier than it should. Nathan Clark had carried hundreds of volumes up these same stairs to the Columbia University Library return desk, but this one made his hands shake. Not from weight. From what he found pressed between pages 247 and 248, a message written in a code his father had taught him to recognize years ago. Soviet intelligence tradecraft, active, current, impossible to ignore. October 1983 marked the height of Cold War paranoia across American university campuses, where Soviet intelligence services had spent decades cultivating networks of sympathizers, informants, and potential agents among students and faculty who represented the future of American policy, science, and military research. Columbia University's Butler Library stood as one of the premier research facilities in the United States, housing over 2 million volumes and serving more than 30,000 students and faculty members who accessed materials on everything from nuclear physics to classified government documents that had been declassified and donated to the university's special collections. The library's Russian literature section occupied the entire fourth floor of the East Wing, a space that had expanded dramatically during the 1970s, when the university received a grant to develop one of the most comprehensive collections of Soviet-era publications outside of Moscow itself, materials that attracted scholars, graduate students, and researchers from intelligence agencies who needed to understand Soviet culture, propaganda, and the subtle messages embedded in officially sanctioned literature. Nathan Clark carried a burden that most 21-year-old literature students never experienced, the weight of growing up as the son of Richard Clark, a man who had spent 28 years working for the Central Intelligence Agency in operations that spanned from Berlin to Moscow to Havana, before retiring in 1979, with commendations that would remain classified for at least another 50 years. Richard had taught his son to read people the way other fathers taught their sons to read box scores, training Nathan from age 12 to spot surveillance, recognize dead drop locations, identify code patterns in seemingly innocent text, and understand that the Cold War was not some abstract political concept, but a daily reality where ordinary places like libraries and bookstores and coffee shops served as battlegrounds for intelligence operations that could determine the fate of nations. Nathan had chosen to study Russian literature, partly to understand his father's old adversaries, and partly to rebel against the expectation that he would follow Richard into the intelligence community. Though his father had warned him that once you learned to see the world through the lens of espionage tradecraft, you could never unsee it. Never stop analyzing every interaction for hidden meaning. Never trust that any encounter was truly random or innocent. The discovery had occurred during the most mundane possible circumstance, as Nathan prepared to return a copy of Bulgakov's The Master and Margarita that he had checked out 3 weeks earlier for a seminar on Soviet dissident literature. He had been flipping through the pages to make sure he had not left any notes or bookmarks inside, when a small piece of paper fell out, roughly 2 inches by 3 inches, covered in what appeared to be random numbers and Cyrillic letters arranged in groups of 5 with specific spacing patterns that his father had taught him to recognize as a basic substitution cipher used by Soviet intelligence for low-priority communications that needed to be passed quickly without sophisticated encryption. The equipment. The paper itself felt wrong, too thick and textured to be ordinary notebook paper, more like the specialty paper stock that intelligence services used because it could be destroyed quickly if compromised, and because it held ink in ways that made forgery more difficult. The message contained what appeared to be coordinates, possibly for locations in Manhattan, along with a series of dates in November and December of 1983, times that suggested scheduled meetings or dead drop servicing, and a reference to something called Operation Harvest that Nathan had never heard his father mention in any of their conversations about Soviet intelligence activities. Nathan spent 40 minutes sitting in a corner study carrel on the library's 3rd floor, using a pencil and notebook to work through the cipher using the basic cryptographic techniques his father had taught him during what Richard had called intellectual exercises, but were actually training sessions for recognizing enemy communications. The pattern revealed itself slowly, confirming Nathan's initial suspicion that this was authentic Soviet intelligence communication rather than some student's creative writing project or elaborate prank. The decoded message referenced specific professors at Columbia, including Dr. Yuri Melnikov, who taught advanced Russian language courses and had emigrated from Leningrad in 1976, along with meeting protocols that described how operatives should use library call numbers as recognition signals and book checkout records as ways to confirm identity without direct verbal communication that could be overheard or recorded by American counterintelligence. Nathan understood immediately that he faced a choice that would define everything that followed, whether to report the message to university security or the FBI as any responsible citizen should do, or to investigate further on his own, using his father's training to understand the scope of the operation, before potentially alerting the Soviets that their communication had been compromised. He photographed the original message using the library's microfilm camera, carefully replaced the paper exactly where he had found it, between pages 247 and 248, and returned the book to the circulation desk while noting the time as 3:47 in the afternoon. His father had taught him that the first rule of counterintelligence was to never reveal what you knew until you understood who else was watching, because Soviet operations always included security layers designed to identify compromises, and premature action could burn an entire investigation while allowing the most valuable targets to escape. The woman at the circulation desk accepted the book without comment. Middle-aged, Eastern European accent. Name tag read Anya. Nathan had never noticed her before. His training kicked in. Had she been working here all semester, or was she new? Was she watching how he handled the book? Were her eyes tracking whether he had discovered something inside? His father's voice echoed in his memory. Paranoia keeps you alive. Complacency gets you killed. The woman smiled at him. Standard library worker smile. Or was it? Nathan walked toward the exit. Every instinct told him to run. Behind him, footsteps matched his pace. A man in a dark coat had stood up from a reading table, following, getting closer. Nathan's heart pounded against his ribs. The KGB knew. They had been watching the book, waiting to see who would find their message. Nathan pushed through the library's main doors and descended the stone steps 2 at a time, his messenger bag bouncing against his hip as he merged into the crowd of students crossing College Walk toward Broadway. The man in the dark coat emerged from the library 30 seconds later, maintaining a distance of approximately 40 feet while pretending to read a folded newspaper that nobody actually read while walking anymore, a surveillance technique so obvious that it had to be either incredibly amateur or deliberately designed to make Nathan panic and reveal whether he understood what he had found. Nathan's father had drilled into him that professional surveillance teams never relied on single operatives because one person could be spotted too easily, which meant either this was a test to see if Nathan recognized surveillance and would react, or the man was not KGB at all but possibly FBI counterintelligence, who had been watching the library as part of an existing investigation and had noticed Nathan's unusual behavior with the Bulgakov book. The walk from Columbia's campus to his father's apartment in Morningside Heights normally took Nathan 15 minutes, but today he extended it to 45 by using every counter-surveillance technique Richard had taught him during their weekend walks through Central Park that had seemed like paranoid exercises at the time, but now felt like survival training. Nathan ducked into the subway station at 116th Street, waited on the platform until the train doors were closing, then slipped through at the last second while watching to see if anyone else made the same move, a classic technique for identifying surveillance that his father called the flush maneuver, because it forced followers to either reveal themselves or lose their target. The man in the dark coat did not follow onto the train, but Nathan spotted a woman in a blue jacket who had been standing near the subway entrance suddenly rush through the closing doors 2 cars down, her timing too perfect to be coincidence, suggesting that the surveillance team was larger and better coordinated than Nathan had initially assessed. Richard Clark lived in a rent-controlled apartment on West 120th Street that he had maintained since 1974, when the CIA had established it as a safe house for operatives rotating through New York assignments, a space that looked like an ordinary retired teacher's modest home, but contained hidden compartments in the walls where Richard still kept equipment from his operational days, including cameras, lock-picking tools, false identification documents, and a Shortwave radio that could receive encrypted broadcasts from frequencies that officially did not exist. Nathan had grown up visiting this apartment every weekend after his parents divorced when he was 9 years old, learning to distinguish between his father's public persona as a retired Foreign Service officer who had worked in cultural exchange programs and the reality of a man who had run agents behind the Iron Curtain and understood Soviet intelligence operations with an intimacy that came from studying and fighting them for nearly 3 decades. Richard had tried to give Nathan a normal childhood while simultaneously preparing him for a world where enemies were real and dangerous, where trust was a calculated risk, and where the seemingly innocent act of checking out a library book could intersect with espionage operations that placed ordinary citizens in extraordinary danger. Nathan climbed the 4 flights to his father's apartment, knocked 3 times with the specific rhythm Richard had taught him, and waited for the sound of the door chain being removed. Richard opened the door wearing reading glasses and a cardigan that made him look exactly like what his cover identity claimed, a retired bureaucrat who spent his days reading history books and listening to classical music. But Nathan saw the way his father's eyes immediately scanned the hallway behind him, and the way his posture shifted slightly, as if preparing for physical confrontation, despite being 62 years old. Richard pulled Nathan inside and closed the door without speaking, then moved to the window to check the street below, using a small mirror angled to see around the edge of the curtain without exposing himself to observation from outside, tradecraft so ingrained that it had become unconscious habit. Nathan placed the photograph of the coded message on Richard's desk, along with his handwritten decryption, and waited while his father studied both documents under the light of an antique lamp that provided the specific color temperature needed to detect forgeries and alterations in paper and ink. Richard's expression remained neutral for the first minute. Then his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, in a way Nathan had learned to recognize as his father processing information that was both surprising and deeply concerning. Richard asked 3 questions in rapid succession without looking up from the documents. Where exactly did you find this? Did anyone see you photograph it? Did you replace it exactly where you found it? Nathan answered each question precisely, including details about the library circulation desk worker named Anya, with the Eastern European accent, and the man in the dark coat who had followed him from the library but had not continued surveillance after Nathan executed the subway flush. Richard finally looked up from the documents, and his eyes carried a weight that Nathan had only seen a few times before. Moments when his father's carefully maintained separation between his old life and his retirement collapsed, and the intelligence officer emerged fully. Richard told Nathan that Operation Harvest was not just active, but was one of the most sophisticated recruitment operations Soviet intelligence had ever run on American soil, targeting not current government officials, but college students who would not be activated as agents for another 10 to 15 years. When they had established careers in government, military, academia, or private industry where they could access valuable information without raising suspicion. The KGB knew someone had found their message. The surveillance team had confirmed it. Nathan had approximately 24 hours before they decided whether he was a genuine threat who needed to be eliminated or a useful idiot who could be manipulated. Richard was being watched too. His phone was tapped, probably had been for years. Someone at the CIA had compromised the operation. Someone Nathan and Richard both knew. The message was bait. They had been waiting for Richard's son to find it. Richard Clark spent the next 6 hours teaching his son how to stay alive in a game where the rules had been written decades ago, by men who understood that Cold War espionage was not about dramatic confrontations, but about patience, misdirection, and the systematic exploitation of human psychology, to turn ordinary people into intelligence assets without them ever fully understanding they had been compromised. The apartment's small kitchen table became a tactical planning station where Richard spread out maps of Columbia University campus, lists of faculty members with Eastern European backgrounds, and surveillance photos that Richard had kept hidden in a false bottom compartment of his bedroom closet. Images that showed various professors and graduate students meeting in locations around Manhattan that could be interpreted as innocent academic collaboration or as sophisticated intelligence. Tradecraft depending on how you analyzed the patterns. Nathan learned that his father had never truly retired from the intelligence community, but had instead shifted into a different role as what Richard called an independent observer, someone who maintained contacts with active CIA officers, monitored Soviet activities in New York City, and provided analysis on operations that the official intelligence bureaucracy was too compromised or too politically constrained to investigate properly. Dr. Yuri Melnikov had arrived in the United States in February of 1976, claiming to be a defector who had grown disillusioned with Soviet totalitarianism after witnessing the persecution of dissident writers during the Brezhnev era, a story that American immigration authorities and CIA debriefers had accepted after months of interrogation that failed to identify any obvious deception or connections to Soviet intelligence services. Melnikov had built an impressive academic career at Columbia University over the following 7 years, publishing 3 books on Russian modernist literature, earning tenure in 1981, and establishing himself as one of the most respected scholars in his field, while also becoming a mentor to dozens of graduate students who studied Russian language and culture. Richard had been suspicious of Melnikov from the beginning because the professor's defection story contained subtle inconsistencies that suggested careful preparation rather than spontaneous flight, including the fact that Melnikov had managed to bring out extensive notes and manuscripts from the Soviet Union, despite the KGB's standard practice of confiscating all materials from defectors, and the fact that Melnikov's family in Leningrad had never faced any apparent retaliation despite Soviet policy of punishing the relatives of traitors. Nathan had taken 2 courses with Professor Melnikov during his junior year and had found the man to be brilliant, charismatic, and genuinely passionate about Russian literature in ways that seemed incompatible with being a deep-cover KGB operative, whose real mission involved recruiting American students for long-term intelligence operations. Melnikov had encouraged Nathan's interest in Soviet dissident writers, had written a strong recommendation letter for Nathan's application to graduate programs in comparative literature, and had invited Nathan to several small dinner parties at his apartment on Riverside Drive, where graduate students and faculty discussed everything from Nabokov's narrative techniques to Solzhenitsyn's moral philosophy while drinking Georgian wine and eating homemade pelmeni that Melnikov prepared himself. The idea that those evenings had been elaborate assessment sessions, where Melnikov evaluated which students might be vulnerable to recruitment, which ones had psychological weaknesses that could be exploited, and which ones had family backgrounds or career ambitions that made them valuable intelligence targets, felt like a betrayal that cut deeper than any abstract Cold War ideology. Richard explained that Soviet intelligence operations in America focused heavily on identifying second-generation immigrants whose parents had fled Eastern Europe or Russia, students who felt torn between 2 cultures, young people who carried resentment about discrimination or economic hardship, and anyone who demonstrated intellectual capacity combined with emotional vulnerability that made them susceptible to manipulation. The KGB understood that immediate recruitment attempts usually failed because Americans had been conditioned by decades of Cold War propaganda to view Soviet approaches with suspicion. So instead, they invested years in building relationships, earning trust, creating obligations, and slowly shifting a target's worldview until cooperation with Soviet intelligence seemed like a reasonable or even moral choice, rather than treason. Operation Harvest represented the ultimate expression of this patient strategy, a program that accepted that recruited agents might not provide useful intelligence for a decade or more, but would eventually be positioned in American institutions where they could influence policy, access classified information, or recruit others who were already in sensitive positions. Nathan asked the question that had been burning in his mind since his father revealed Operation Harvest's scope. How many students at Columbia had been targeted? Richard pulled out a notebook filled with names, dates, and connections drawn in his precise handwriting. At least 47 that he had identified over the past 5 years, maybe twice that many he had not confirmed. The operation extended beyond Columbia to NYU, Princeton, Harvard, MIT, every major university on the East Coast. Hundreds of students being cultivated. Most would never be activated. Some would reject recruitment when it finally came. But even a 5% success rate meant dozens of Soviet agents embedded in American institutions by the year 2000. Richard lit a cigarette, despite having quit smoking 3 years earlier. His hands shook slightly. He told Nathan that he had reported his suspicions about Melnikov to the FBI in 1979 and again in 1981. Both times the reports had been dismissed as paranoid speculation from a retired spook who could not accept that the Cold War was becoming less relevant. But Richard had kept investigating on his own, built his case, documented meetings, photographed dead drops, recorded conversations. Then 6 months ago, his contact at the FBI had been transferred to a field office in Alaska. His phone started making clicking sounds. His mail arrived opened and resealed. Someone powerful wanted him to stop. The message Nathan found was not random. Melnikov had placed it in that specific book, in the library section Nathan frequented, timed for when Nathan would need to return it. They wanted Richard to know, wanted him to understand his son was now part of their operation, the ultimate leverage, cooperate or watch Nathan become collateral damage. Richard made the decision that would define everything in the following 6 months, within 40 seconds of explaining to Nathan that the message had been bait designed to force Richard's cooperation through threatening his son. They would not run. They would not hide. They would not report to the FBI or CIA through official channels where the mole who had compromised Richard's earlier reports could intercept and neutralize their information. Instead, they would do what Richard had spent 28 years training to do. They would infiltrate the operation, document everything, identify the American traitor, and deliver evidence so overwhelming that even a compromised intelligence bureaucracy could not ignore or suppress it. Richard told Nathan that this decision carried risks that included federal prosecution for unauthorized intelligence operations, assassination by Soviet agents who discovered their investigation, or complete professional destruction if they were wrong about Melnikov and Operation Harvest, turned out to be Richard's paranoid delusion rather than genuine Soviet espionage. Nathan spent the following 3 weeks maintaining his normal routine as a Columbia literature student, while secretly operating as his father's primary intelligence asset in a private counterintelligence operation that violated approximately 17 federal laws and multiple CIA regulations about retired officers conducting unauthorized activities on American soil. Nathan continued attending Professor Melnikov's seminar on Soviet dissident literature every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon, taking notes on Pasternak and Akhmatova while simultaneously observing which students Melnikov paid particular attention to, which ones received invitations to his apartment, and which ones seemed to develop sudden interests in government careers or defense industry jobs that had not been part of their previous academic plans. Richard had taught Nathan to use a miniature camera disguised as a pen to photograph documents and had shown him how to conduct what intelligence officers called black bag jobs, breaking into offices and apartments to copy files without leaving evidence of entry, techniques that Richard claimed were relics of Cold War tradecraft, but that Nathan discovered still worked perfectly in 1983, when most people trusted physical locks and filing cabinets to protect sensitive materials. The breakthrough came on November 17th, when Nathan used a duplicated key to enter Melnikov's campus office at 2 in the morning and discovered that the professor maintained 2 sets of student files in his locked cabinet, the official academic files that contained grades and recommendation letters, and a second set of files hidden behind a false back panel that contained psychological assessments, family background investigations, financial vulnerability analyses, and recruitment. Timelines for 23 students who Melnikov had identified as candidates for long-term development as Soviet intelligence assets. Nathan photographed every page using the specialized camera his father had provided, working in total darkness with only a red-filtered pen light to avoid detection by campus security patrols that passed through the building every 90 minutes. The files revealed that Melnikov had been running Operation Harvest at Columbia since 1977 and had successfully recruited 4 students who had already graduated and were now working in positions at the State Department, Defense Department, and 2 major defense contractors where they had begun providing classified information to Soviet handlers through dead drops and coded communications that the FBI had never detected. Richard spent 5 days analyzing the photographs Nathan had taken and cross-referencing the information against his own surveillance records and intelligence reports that he had maintained through his network of contacts who still trusted him despite his unofficial status. The pattern that emerged was more disturbing than Richard had anticipated, because it revealed that Operation Harvest was not just a Soviet intelligence initiative, but had been allowed to continue operating for years despite American counterintelligence having identified multiple warning signs that should have triggered investigations. Someone in the American intelligence community had been actively protecting Melnikov and suppressing reports about Soviet recruitment activities at East Coast universities. Someone with enough authority to transfer FBI agents who asked too many questions. Someone with access to classified communications who could warn Soviet operatives when they were in danger of exposure. Someone who had betrayed the United States not for money or ideology, but for reasons that Richard suspected were far more personal and complicated. Nathan returned to Melnikov's office 3 more times over the following 2 weeks, each break-in providing additional pieces of the puzzle, including communications that revealed Melnikov reported to a KGB handler named Yuri Korolev, who operated under diplomatic cover at the Soviet mission to the United Nations, and more critically, documents that showed Melnikov received information about American counterintelligence operations from a source identified only by the codename Harvest Moon, who had been providing intelligence to the Soviets since at least 1974. Richard recognized the operational timeline immediately. 1974 was the same year Richard had established his safe house apartment in Morningside Heights. The same year Richard had been running operations against Soviet intelligence in New York. The same year Richard had worked with a young FBI liaison officer named Justin Walker, who had seemed like an ally in the fight against Soviet espionage, but who had inexplicably received rapid promotions despite never producing significant intelligence results. The confrontation happened not in some dramatic location, but in a diner on Broadway near Columbia campus on December 3rd at 7 in the morning, when Richard arranged a meeting with FBI Special Agent Justin Walker, who now held the position of Assistant Director for Counterintelligence at FBI headquarters in Washington, D.C. Richard brought a briefcase containing copies of everything Nathan had photographed, along with Richard's own analysis, proving that Walker had been the one protecting Melnikov, that Walker had been Harvest Moon, that Walker had spent 9 years betraying American intelligence operations to Soviet handlers, while simultaneously rising through FBI ranks because his Soviet connections had helped him produce just enough intelligence to appear successful while never actually compromising operations. That truly mattered to Moscow. Walker arrived at the diner looking exactly like what he had become, a senior federal law enforcement official whose expensive suit and confident bearing reflected a man who believed he was untouchable, someone who had played both sides for so long that he had convinced himself his actions were justified by the complexity of Cold War realities rather than simple treason. Richard slid the briefcase across the table. Walker opened it. His face remained neutral for approximately 10 seconds. Then he smiled. He asked Richard if he really thought anyone would believe the paranoid accusations of a retired CIA officer who had been flagged as potentially unstable since his forced retirement in '79. Richard said he had already delivered copies to 3 journalists, 2 congressional staffers, and 1 active CIA officer who Walker did not control. Walker's smile disappeared. Walker explained that Richard had misunderstood everything. The protection of Melnikov had been authorized. Operation Harvest was a false flag operation run by American intelligence. They were letting the Soviets recruit students so they could identify which ones were vulnerable and turn them into double agents feeding false information back to Moscow. Walker had been the architect of the most successful counterintelligence operation in Cold War history. Everything was under control. Everything was sanctioned. Richard was destroying years of careful work. Richard asked one question. Why was Walker's name in Melnikov's files as someone who received monthly payments from Soviet intelligence through a Cayman Islands bank account? Walker's expression changed. Not surprise, calculation. The diner suddenly felt very small, very exposed. Walker stood up. He told Richard that he had made a serious mistake, that Richard's son Nathan was already being watched by people who did not accept surrender or negotiation, that accidents happened to students all the time, that Richard should consider what mattered more, justice or family. Nathan had been sitting 3 booths away wearing headphones and recording everything. He stood up, removed the headphones, placed the recording device on Walker's table. Federal agents entered through both the front and back doors of the diner. Real federal agents. The ones Richard had contacted through channels Walker did not control. Walker was arrested without resistance. He never stopped smiling. He told Richard that he would be out in 72 hours, that his connections went deeper than Richard imagined, that this would not end the way Richard hoped. Walker was wrong about the 72 hours. The evidence Richard and Nathan had collected was too comprehensive, too detailed, too corroborated by multiple sources to be dismissed or suppressed, even by Walker's powerful allies within the intelligence community. Walker was held without bail pending trial on charges of espionage, conspiracy, and betraying the United States to foreign intelligence services. Professor Yuri Melnikov disappeared from his Columbia apartment 12 hours after Walker's arrest, presumably extracted by Soviet intelligence before American counterintelligence could arrest him, and was never seen in the United States again, though Richard received unconfirmed reports years later that Melnikov had been quietly executed by the KGB in 1987 after Moscow concluded that his operation had been too thoroughly compromised to ever be rehabilitated. Nathan Clark spent the following 6 months being interrogated by FBI counterintelligence specialists who needed to understand exactly what he had found, how he had conducted his investigation, and whether he had been compromised by Soviet intelligence during his contact with Melnikov. The interrogations were thorough, sometimes aggressive, and always focused on the question of whether Nathan's discovery of the coded message had been genuine accident, or whether Nathan himself had been recruited and was now attempting to infiltrate American intelligence by pretending to expose a Soviet operation. Richard was investigated simultaneously on suspicion that he had shared classified information with his son and had conducted unauthorized intelligence operations that violated his retirement agreement with the CIA. Both investigations eventually concluded that Nathan and Richard had acted out of patriotic duty rather than criminal intent, though the CIA made clear that Richard's intelligence career was truly over this time, and that any future contact with active operations would result in federal prosecution. Justin Walker's trial lasted 7 weeks in federal court, under conditions of tight security that prevented most details from becoming public, though enough information leaked to newspapers that Walker's betrayal became one of the largest counterintelligence scandals of the 1980s. Walker received a sentence of 40 years in federal prison after being convicted on 18 counts of espionage, though he continued to maintain that his actions had been part of a sanctioned operation until his death from a heart attack in federal prison in 2001. The 4 students who had been recruited by Melnikov and were already working in sensitive government positions were identified, arrested, and prosecuted, with varying results ranging from prison sentences to immunity deals in exchange for cooperation with counterintelligence investigators who needed to understand the full scope of Operation Harvest and how many other students at other universities might have been similarly compromised. Nathan Clark never received any official recognition or thanks from the CIA or FBI for his role in exposing Operation Harvest, and in fact spent the rest of his life under periodic surveillance by American intelligence agencies who never entirely trusted that he had not been compromised during his contact with Melnikov. Nathan abandoned his plans for graduate school in Russian literature and instead became a high school English teacher in Philadelphia, a deliberately ordinary life that he chose because he had seen enough of espionage and intelligence operations to know that secrecy and betrayal corrupted everything they touched. Nathan married at 30, had 2 daughters, and never told his family the complete story of what had happened during his final semester at Columbia University, though he kept copies of all the documents locked in a safe deposit box with instructions that they should be released to researchers after his death. Richard Clark lived another 18 years after Walker's arrest, dying in 2001 at the age of 80 from complications related to emphysema that doctors attributed to decades of cigarette smoking during his CIA career. Richard never expressed regret about involving his son in a dangerous counterintelligence operation, and in fact told Nathan during their last conversation that those 6 months investigating Operation Harvest had been the only time in Richard's entire career when he felt certain that he was serving American interests, rather than the bureaucratic and political agendas that had corrupted intelligence work since the Vietnam War. Richard left behind 17 boxes of documents related to Soviet intelligence operations that the CIA seized after his death and classified for 75 years, ensuring that his full contribution to American counterintelligence would remain hidden until 2076, when researchers might finally understand the scope of what Richard had accomplished and sacrificed. The coded message that Nathan had found pressed between pages 247 and 248 of Bulgakov's The Master and Margarita remained in FBI custody as evidence in the Walker case, a small piece of paper that had triggered one of the most significant counterintelligence investigations of the Cold War and had changed Nathan's life in ways he spent decades trying to understand. Nathan never read Bulgakov again, never studied Russian literature, never returned to Columbia University. Some discoveries could not be undone, some knowledge could not be forgotten, some books remained closed forever,